Hello, friends. We are gearing up for our annual No Small Endeavor Live Thanksgiving show on November 24 at the beautiful Schermerhorn Symphony Center in Nashville, Tennessee. If you've never been, these shows honor our roots as a live variety show, and let me tell you, we pull out all the stops. World-class musicians, interview guests, descend on Nashville for a night of music, conversation, and storytelling that you do not want to miss. Last year, for example, we were joined by Malcolm Gladwell, Vince Gill, Brian Sutton, and a stage full of musicians and performers. Now look, here's the deal. If you want access to an exclusive pre-sale for this year's show at the Schermerhorn, hurry over to sign up for NSC Plus, our bonus community, for just $5 a month. Last year, No Small Endeavor at the Schermerhorn sold out, so don't miss the chance to grab your tickets early. The pre-sale begins September 13. We want to see you at the show, so go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus today. Again, go today to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus. See you soon. Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSC Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSC Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSC Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. Hello, friends. This is No Small Endeavor. I'm Lee C. Camp. You're listening to our Unabridged interview with Professor Edith Hall. Edith is a world-renowned classicist. She's held faculty positions at Cambridge and Oxford and King's College, London. We discussed today her book, Aristotle's Way, How Ancient Wisdom Can Change Your Life. If you've listened to our podcast much, you know that I tend to think that Aristotle gives us an immensely helpful way of thinking about the meaning and the nature of a good life, and a strongly competing way to think about happiness, namely, rather than thinking of happiness as a merely subjective state related to getting the pleasures that we want, that instead he thinks of happiness as a sort of objective reality that comes along with the pursuit of a life we would define as good, or that one might be able to define as good. I do find it immensely, both intellectually, a very helpful construct, and as you'll see in this interview, highly practical and immensely helpful. Enjoy. Here's Edith Hall. Hey there, it's Lee. If you're looking for another show that looks at all of the ways to build bridges as a means to living a better life, then check out A Fine Mess, the new podcast from our friends at Evoke Media. Recently named a must-listen by The Guardian and Apple Podcasts, A Fine Mess brings on forward-thinking leaders to tackle tough conversations with understanding and curiosity. Each episode, narrative change philanthropist and host Sabrina Miraj Naeem sits down with acclaimed guests like Stanford University lecturer Matt Abrahams on how to approach divisive political conversations, and legendary Daily Show correspondent and comedian Samantha Bee on the appeal and implications of satirical news and how we can become more responsible consumers. So don't miss out. Replace assumptions with understanding with A Fine Mess. Available every Monday wherever you listen to podcasts. And tell them I sent you. Edith Hall is a world-renowned classicist, currently professor at King's College, London, having held numerous faculty positions, including at Cambridge and Oxford. Her specialism is ancient Greek literature. Edith has now published 30 books, broadcasts frequently on radio and television, works as a consultant with professional theaters, lectures all over the world, and publishes widely in both academic and mainstream publications. Today, we're discussing her book, Aristotle's Way, How Ancient Wisdom Can Change Your Life. Welcome, Edith.
Lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you. Thank you for joining us from your home there in Cambridgeshire, and delightful to have you. As I think about one of the ways in which you are helping lay folks, we might say, come to an appreciation of Aristotle, it strikes me that you're trying to make the case that philosophy is grounded in both wonder and practicality, and holding two things together that oftentimes don't get held together.
I think that's exactly right. Aristotle's whole worldview, his whole philosophy starts, he says, from a sense of wonder and curiosity at the world. The opening line of his book on metaphysics, the opening sentence is, it's absolutely natural for human beings to wonder at the world and want to understand it. And he also thinks that's the mark of the human being. He thinks that that's what makes the human animal different from the other animals, is that we have this capacity for wonder, curiosity, and reason. And that is the human function, is to exercise those faculties of wonder and curiosity and reason. And he thinks that by doing that, thinking about the world, thinking about anything in the world, you can think about biology, you can try to understand how bodies work and build up the skills and build up the knowledge and put it into practice. It's very similar, he thinks, doing philosophy to doing medicine, where you learn your craft, you learn exactly how the body works. He thinks with philosophy, you learn how morals and ethics and the rules of life work, and you develop those as you go through life by practical application. So you actually assuage your curiosity and fulfill your sense of wonder by practical immersion in the nitty-gritty of everyday life.
Yeah, and the practicalities that you develop in the book are so fascinating and so broad, so diverse and holistic. So the practicalities ranging from decision-making to politics, from sex and drink to justice, all-encompassing holistic vision of life in which no stone needs to be left unturned in living a good life.
Absolutely. In fact, you have to turn them over to see what's underneath.
Yeah. And as well, then, driving this whole vision is the notion of happiness, right? That this is key to what it means to be human.
Yes. His word for it is eudaimonia. So sometimes his ethics get called eudaimonic ethics. But by happiness, he doesn't mean exactly the way that it's understood, I think, in modern English. It's sometimes translated by philosophers living well, but that doesn't mean living well by eating a lot. It means living in a virtuous way and fulfilling your human potential. I actually like the old Latin translation is felicitas. And it is an English word, felicity,
right? Yeah,
which means something a little bit different from happiness. The real way to understand it, though, is that it's a verb. It's something you do. It's a way of life. It is not a state. It's not a psychological state that you achieve either temporarily, which is the way we tend to understand it, like having a happy meal or happy hour in the bar, or even permanently, because he doesn't think you can. He thinks you've got to remake it with every encounter that you have in life, with every situation. You have to remake it every day. So I like to see it as a verb, to live well, to do your best, to try to be the best version of yourself, because that will make you happy.
Yeah, you have this quotation from John F. Kennedy that I thought captures this well. The full use, that happiness along these lines is, quote, the full use of your powers along lines of excellence in a life affording scope.
Exactly. So it's actually also very charitable. He's very well aware, Aristotle, that vast numbers of people in his world and our world today don't have that scope. The scope means sufficient opportunities and support, especially in childhood, to identify your potential and achieve it. And some of that is just down to luck. And he's extremely clear about that and recognizes his privilege as someone prosperous enough in a society where people did a very great deal of work and there were slaves, that he has got the freedom to exercise his full capacities along lines of excellence in a life according scope.
And this then points us towards, you have, I guess early in the book, you talk about taking potential seriously and scoping out a telos for one's life. So could you kind of describe to us the notion of a telos and then how that leads to taking one's potential seriously?
Yes. Well, Aristotle thinks that everything has a telos. That is the Greek for an end, but it doesn't just mean a conclusion. It means a purpose to be fulfilled. It's a cause. It's
Right.
why we're here. And he thinks that we've all got one. All human beings, as babies, have got the telos of becoming the potential. That's dunamis in Greek, our word dynamite, actually.
Yeah.
But you have the potential, if you're a little tiny baby, to become a fully functioning, fully educated, fully healthy, fully socially integrated adult Homo sapiens. We all do. But then beyond that, we've all got our own telos, which is about, some people say teleology, some people say teleology. It's American English issue.
Yeah.
But we all have a different perfect ourselves we could be. So it might be that you are destined, we might say, to be a great teacher, a great parent, a great gardener, a great violinist, a great lawyer, a great cook, any of those things. And true happiness means really getting that identified early enough that you can focus on being as good at that as you possibly can be. And this is incredibly helpful advice, I think, for anybody either in education. Both you and I have been, educators. So we're dealing with trying to help young people find out what it is that they're really good at, or as a parent.
Right.
If people force destinies or a telos on their child that isn't their true one, then they're never going to be happy, because they're not going to be doing what they enjoy. And Aristotle's very clear that pleasure, this is very refreshing for people brought up in very puritanical or ascetic traditions, but pleasure is the best guide. He would say, look at a child, see what they enjoy, and from that, try to infer or deduce how they could actually monetize
it. make a life that way. Right.
But I mean, people like Bob Dylan has said he got paid for doing the one thing he loved.
Right.
And how lucky is that? I feel the same. I've got paid for researching and teaching. Yeah. How lucky is that? Right. If somebody had tried to make me a chartered accountant or a anaesthetist, I'd have been miserable.
Yeah.
I might have been able to do it, but I wouldn't have been fulfilling my true potential. So I wouldn't have been that good at it, and I wouldn't have been happy. Yeah. So I think this is an incredibly positive and helpful concept. And it's very sort of egalitarian or embracing, because he really does believe everybody's got something that they're good at. Right. Absolutely everybody. Yeah. And that a fully happy, functioning community is going to work because, I wouldn't say God, but that humans have been given such variety of talents that it actually makes for, isn't that in itself wonderful, that some of us are good at cooking, some of us are good at music, and some of us are good at driving cars. Isn't that fantastic?
Yeah. Yeah, and as the son of an accountant myself, I've always been very deeply grateful for the ways in which my parents did precisely what you were just describing. Right. They looked for the things that brought me joy and then encouraged me in those things. Yeah. You have a line in that particular chapter where you say, an unplanned life is indeed less worth living. And it strikes me as how it seems that too often education and or a consumerist life, consumerist goals that get set before us, encourage us to take the space to indeed plan a life. We might spend more time planning a vacation than we do planning our life, it seems to me.
Absolutely. And I don't think that young people, I visit an awful lot of schools and colleges for 16 to 18-year-olds, because I think that's crucial period, that young adulthood. And I'm always amazed and distressed by how little attention these young people have had paid to really thinking about what they want to do. Yeah. Then how to tailor the means and resources that they've got, right? You have to do that. We live in the real world. But then also really be encouraged to go for it. I mean, nobody ever lay on their deathbed regretting that they tried to do something and failed, I don't think. I think people are on their deathbeds really regretting the things they didn't try that they should have done.
Which is a beautiful way to reframe. In the Christian tradition, we have the sins of commission and the sins of omission, and yet you point to the way in which Aristotle has that same distinction, right? And that it might
long
be helpful
Christianity,
long before
Christianity,
and that here you have this notion of thinking of a failure of omission to construe that on your deathbed of what did I fail to do?
Yeah.
Put this thought of experiment of putting myself in that place and thinking, what did I fail to do? It's a terribly helpful practical exercise.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. The one thing you've already begun to point to is that this notion of happiness does not mean that things always simply go well for oneself. Nor does it rule out the notion that one's life might be characterized by what we would characterize as sharp periods of suffering. But one could still have this sort of happiness, right? That Aristotle's pointing us to.
Yes, it's tied in very much with his another concept of his, which is self-sufficiency. This is something that only you can do for yourself. This is something you have to take responsibility for. Right, you cannot expect someone else to present you with happiness.
Yeah.
So it's hard work. It means being very adult, right, and taking charge. But that it has the upside that nobody can actually take it away from you. So that if you have got yourself to a point that you're quite sustaining and self-sufficient in the ways you produce good feelings inside yourself, then even if the worst happens and you're persecuted or prosecuted or imprisoned for something you didn't do, people can't take away your inner peace with yourself that you didn't actually do what they claimed you did. It can't. It's actually indestructible, and even absolutely terrible bad luck. And he's very, very sanguine about misfortune. He's very, very aware that bad luck is out there, and there's a lot of things people can't control about what happens to them. But he says that means that even if you are badly bereaved or something really shocking happens to you, you lose all your money, you've still got this inner peace of mind that you were trying to do your best. And I think that once I decided to give his ethics a real go, which was in my mid-20s, what I don't have is a huge burden ever of personal guilt, right? Because I make mistakes, but they are not intentional.
Yeah.
I can always I know I've been trying to do my best.
Yeah.
Now that may sometimes lead to, as I say, we don't always get it right with what we've decided to do.
Yeah.
That we think for the best, but I know I tried and wanted to do my best. And I think that being able to look yourself in the mirror every night or on your deathbed at your past, I know I talk about deathbeds a lot, but he did. He really did. That I'd be able to say, well, actually, there weren't many times when I wittingly did a bad thing. And that gives you an immense amount of freedom from a certain kind of mental torture.
Yeah. Yeah. I have found as a recovering legalist or moralist or perfectionist, I would say, which was very much induced in me, I think, or inculcated in me by my faith tradition, that having the virtue traditions inform my thinking about living a good life has helped in significant ways let go of that inner beating of myself, beating up of myself, because and I love the fact that, and I want to move to this in just a moment, but I'll kind of preempt some of this conversation. I love the notion that any virtue has associated vices of excess and deficiency, and it may be that when I'm messing up, that may be a sign actually of growth, because it just points to the fact that I'm learning to do a particular virtue better.
Yeah.
And it allows this great space of learning rather than this legalistic beating of oneself up.
Yeah, there's no real place for self-flagellation in virtue ethics, because once you're committed to trying to do your best, then you can be much more at ease with yourself. Self-hatred, he thinks, is completely pointless.
Yeah.
And why would you dislike yourself? And it's also huge relief. Well, we can go on to talk about this, but it's not just virtues; it's also just instincts and passions and emotions. So the sort of Christian and Platonic model, I mean, his teacher is Plato, but that you've got all these undesirable bodily urges and instincts, he thinks is just a nonsense. He thinks because we're animals, they're a guide to the good. Instincts, he sees hunger makes an animal go out and find good nutrition. Sex drive makes an animal go out and reproduce itself to keep the species going.
Right, exactly.
How can they be inherently bad?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Great relief to me when I was 20 years old.
Indeed. But so before we go to that, let me point to one more thing that relates to this notion of potentiality and planning one's life, and that's this notion of magnanimity.
Yeah.
And I love teaching my students about magnanimity, because it's this picture of I'm going to try to take every aspect, again, going back to the holistic piece, right? I'm going to try to take everything about my life seriously, not in taking myself overly seriously, but seriously. This is a space of gift, and this is a space of wonder in which the whole of my life now can unfold before me as a way of every facet of my life continuing to be open to the possibility of growth, the possibility of joy, the possibility of learning something new in every facet of my life.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautifully
put.
Give us a little primer here then on virtues as a mean between two associated vices.
Okay, so Aristotle thinks that the way that you'll get to feel much happier and be a more fulfilled person is to turn to the best possible version of yourself. All right. And that means identifying what are your inherent good points, the things you're good at, morally, and the things that you're not. And he even gives a very helpful chart of these in his second big book on ethics, the Eudemian Ethics. The point about these is that you take any, I wouldn't even call it a virtue, but a characteristic, actually, just a characteristic of one's psyche. Let's take anger, okay? So if you're a Christian or a Platonist, then anger is a bad thing, which you're supposed to try and suppress. It's turn the other cheek.
Or at least for some Christians, yeah. Well,
yes. Quite.
Yeah.
But that's being meek and mild and being in control of yourself. Aristotle says, well, actually, that's not quite the case. Because somebody incapable of anger cannot, he thinks, be a proper moral agent. So you could take the example, if your child is bullied at school and you don't feel extremely angry about that, then you won't have the drive to get the child into the head teacher's office to ask who the bully is and what's going to be done about it. On the other hand, that's deficiency. On the other hand, if you have too much anger, then you're going to be angry. You've got anger management problems. Yeah. You're going to be angry completely inappropriately with people who don't deserve it, in the wrong situation at the wrong time. And we all know people like that as well.
Right.
So he says there's something between moral apathy, right, and not caring less about bad things being done to you or your dependents, and excessive anger. So there is an appropriate amount of anger, which will, if properly channeled, make you go and do the right thing. And I always sort of have people like Martin Luther King in my mind about that. Very well channeled anger. Right. If he had not been angry about the situation of African Americans, he would have been, in Aristotle's eye, deficient, morally deficient, and not a proper moral agent.
Right.
Now, as somebody with very strong emotions, I was, a very passionate child. I said, I'm a passionate person. This proved so much more helpful than just being told to repress it.
Right.
Yeah. It was to think very hard whenever I felt anger about whether it was actually justified, appropriate, and what I could do with it constructively.
Yeah.
So you can take that for any instinct or any emotion. It's about getting it in the right level. This is so much. I think this is very much more 20. I think it's why Aristotle's so much more suited to the 21st century, because post Freud, we've all learnt that actually instincts and drives and emotions aren't necessarily a bad thing, and to embrace our inner child, but just learn that we've got to be adult about appropriate contexts and degrees of expression of those emotions.
Yeah, the first time I reading the Nicomachean Ethics, and I read Aristotle saying that the virtuous person will be angry in the right way for the right length of time with the right intensity with regard to the right thing. I think the first time I read that, first time I read it, I had a sort of immaturity, and I thought, well, thanks, that's very helpful. But then the more I've reflected on it, I thought, this is brilliant, right?
Yeah.
And it gives this sort of multifaceted prudential response to the situation that requires a lot of discernment about what this anger, how it might be helpful to us.
So you've got this little chart in the Demon Ethics, which I do reproduce in the book, it's really quite simple. It's like taking a questionnaire on yourself. You've got to answer it honestly, though.
Yeah.
But you've got to figure out which ones you're already actually quite good at. Mm-hmm. So I've never had a problem with feeling empathy, for example. But I was very aware that I had a huge problem with being vengeful. Okay. And again, he thinks that you need a certain amount of capacity for desire for revenge. He says, again, you're not a correct moral agent. I mean, if somebody smashes into your kid because they're a drunk driver, then you need the desire for revenge to get you into court, to get them financial support, so that they can have wheelchairs and properly adjusted cars for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Right? You need to feel...
It's grounded in justice.
Yeah. But I had... My life was dominated till I started working on this one by desire to get at people for quite minor snubs and insults and so on. So I did my own sort of thing on what I was good at. It also helped me identify my skills. I mean, modesty is a particularly interesting one, because especially, I don't know if it's quite the same in American culture, but in British culture, especially for women, any kind of self-congratulation or just self-awareness of what your skills are, you are never, ever allowed to say it. You have got to denigrate yourself, okay? And he says this is just pointless, okay? There's a mean between false modesty, which doesn't get anybody anywhere. I mean, if we were on a desert island and people were to say, is anybody here a good cook? It wouldn't be very helpful if I didn't say, yes, I am. Do you see what I mean?
Yes,
I mean,
exactly, right.
I'll take it, I'll do the kitchen.
Yeah.
Of course, I don't want to say, yes, I'm the best ever cook the world has ever seen, because that's nonsense.
Right.
But saying, no, I'm not a good cook when I am, right. But in fact, I do find in British culture, even and professionally, the ban on especially women being clear about their, just clear about what they're good at. So this helped me realize that actually I was a very good communicator, right? And had a good analytical brain. So those are the two things I'm good at. Then there are all the things I'm terribly bad at, like being chaotic, quick to vindictiveness. He's very interesting on money, because my reaction to having had an incredibly financially mean father was to be profligate with money. I mean, really profligate. Give it away to anybody, get into debt, just telling myself it didn't matter. But of course it matters, especially when you've got defendants. So the mean between meanness and stinginess on one side and profligacy is just financial responsibility.
Right.
So everybody will have different things in Aristotle's list that they will recognize that they need to work on, or that they can actually be proud of and work to enhance and fulfill further.
Yeah.
But it's so much more humane and forgiving than most other monotheistic and Platonic, and indeed the other ancient philosophical schools like Stoicism were very down on emotion.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, very unusually fitting for the 21st century.
Yeah. Two things kind of come to mind here. One, I would like to mention briefly that, like going back, for example, to turn the other cheek, that is in the common Christian and non-Christian imagination a sort of invitation to passivity. But these days, there's a lot of research that's been done in framing things like the Sermon on the Mount in terms of virtue ethics. And it's fascinating scholarship. And so, for example, one of the things that some suggest is going on with Jesus in, for example, turn the other cheek, is that he's providing a kind of virtuous practice that is actually a mean between fight or flight.
Right.
And that in its context, turn the other cheek had this powerful culture, because of the cultural cues and the cultural particularities. It was a way in which someone of a lower class could respond to an insult from someone from the upper class in a way that turned the tables upside down and made a new possibility occur in that context.
That is really interesting. I'd never heard that.
Yeah, it's just remarkable sorts of material. Walter Wink is one of the scholars that popularized that.
No, that is good. And of course, was always struck as a child by the one serious fit of anger that in the New Testament from
Right.
Jesus of Nazareth, when he overturned the tables of the money changers.
Yeah.
There is one occasion on which
Yeah.
he did get notably angry, and that sort of puzzled me.
Or even the Apostle Paul will say, be angry, but don't sin, right? It's that the point is not to not be angry. It's not to let it fall into something that will cause damage or harm. And in that kind of phrase, I hear an Aristotelian sort of framing of that.
Yes.
So, the other thing that reminds me is going back to your conversation about pleasures, again, raised as a teetotaler, for example, in Southern Protestant culture, I find his conversation of temperance so terribly helpful, and to realize that it could be that abstinence is actually a vice, where and indulgence, obviously, when it overtakes oneself, is a vice. But instead, you're wanting to try to find the ways in which, as you said, pleasure is not the problem. It's the rightful enjoyment of the pleasure, or the rightful ordering of the pleasure, which I think is a very liberating sort of insight.
Well, it is ancient Greek, and the idea that wine was not life enhancing at the right amount, at the right time, with the right people, would have been an absolute nonsense to any ancient Greek. They simply couldn't understand it. That they had hugely ritualized, constructive drinking. The whole point about the symposium was that, which is where a lot of philosophy is done, is that you never drank more than anybody else, and it was served, in measured proportions, at quite big distances, and mixed with water and all that kind of thing. So it was the good things, the relaxation and the physical pleasure and the conviviality without the bad things.
Yeah, it's have what you know, have Europeans had any sort of similar hang-ups about something like alcohol as we Americans have had?
Well, certainly amongst radical Protestants, yes.
Okay, yeah.
And all the European Muslims, of course. We have large numbers of very integrated Muslims, most of whom do adhere quite strictly to no alcohol, and that they're Europeans. But so for a long time, it was very difficult to get alcohol on a Sunday, especially in Wales and Scotland, with large nonconformist Protestant communities.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. We really appreciate y'all sending them over here.
Exactly. I think the laissez-faire, the Anglican Church, by and large, which is your Episcopalian,
right,
which is the Church of England, is much more laissez-faire. It has been ever since 1689, when it became sort of official settlement. So we don't have exactly the same problems. I mean, I do remember when I first went to I had a job at Swarthmore in what turned out to be a dry county.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the day we arrived, we'd had a very long flight. We couldn't get a beer. We could not get a beer. And in the end, my husband actually drove to another state. He drove on a state line just because we needed a beer after this horrible time in the airplane. And that was our introduction to. So I do completely understand it. But by and large, I think that the more extreme the Christian beliefs, the more likely they were to end up feeling persecuted and having to go to America.
Yeah. So speaking of another kind of Christian, Jewish and or Christian construct, the notion of sin. So in biblical Koine Greek, the word is hamartia that gets translated sin. And this obviously is a significant construct in Greco-Roman literature as well. But as I have learned a bit about the use of the word in let's say virtue traditions, this kind of hamartia points to some sort of potential defect that can destroy a person. Is that right?
I'm not sure about that. It may be later than Aristotle. In Aristotle, hamartia is very clear. It means making a mistake.
Okay.
An error. Which can be of judgment and therefore moral. It can be, you can take completely the wrong decision and do something decide to do something very unpleasant. But it's not a flaw. It was mistranslated as flaw, actually, interestingly, in the Renaissance. The metaphor comes from archery. I don't know if you knew that.
To miss the mark, right?
You miss the target altogether. The point about hamartia is that if you hamartanine is the verb, you shoot your arrow and it doesn't even stick into the target. It goes completely off. So it's like a complete miss shot. So he uses it, for example, of Oedipus simply doesn't he makes a massive error of ignorance. He doesn't know who he is. So he ends up marrying his mother and killing his father and so on. But it's not actually the same as a long-term moral state.
Okay. Yeah.
It's instantiated in serial actions.
Okay. Yeah. Very helpful. Let's talk a little bit about the musician, or the kind of exemplars that Aristotle uses to kind of illustrate the moral life. Could you talk just a little bit about musicians, for example?
Yes, he's got some favorite figures that he compares the person who's trying to learn to be an ethically good person, trying to learn virtue. Aristotle likes to compare learning to be virtuous with learning to be a doctor, a physician, or learning to be a musician or an architect or any one of these professions. So there are certain things that you have to analyze, certain natural skills you have to put together, and then you have to learn how to make them effective through continual practice. And then sooner or later, the beauty of this is if you put it into continual practice, right, a particular way of behaving towards other people. So, for example, smiling and saying good day when you meet people in the street, as opposed to scowling or spitting at them, it will become habitual. And he's quite clear about this, that it may feel like terribly hard work at first, trying to do the right thing by people all the time in every encounter, but it becomes habitual. And I actually like the analogy there of driving a car. We drive geared cars in Europe. And when you first start learning a car, you have to think consciously every time, shall I go into first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear? After a few months of driving, you don't even think about it. It becomes habitual.
Yeah.
So as you acquire the skills and you actually study the nitty gritty, the sort of architectural principles, or the parts of the body or the parts of the soul, if it's ethics, your virtues, you then have to go out and dry run them the whole time with every encounter that you have with people. And through that, you will learn practical wisdom. We all know that people do tend to acquire wisdom with experience. And one of the sad things about our society is we don't tend to recognize how much old people know, how much they've been around the block. But it will also become much more habitual. My own example of that was my parents didn't I said smile at people in the street. Well, actually, my parents were very, 1950s, 1960s parent. They did not smile if you went to them as a child to ask for help. You tended to get scowls, like, what do you want? Sort of thing. And I was traumatized by this.
Yeah.
So I swore with my kids that I would put whatever I was doing down if they came to me, switch off the radio or TV and say, how can I help you, darling? Right? So that they always felt they could come to me.
Right.
Now, I went so overboard with this that my daughters actually laugh about it. So it was sort of so extreme. But in fact, I do believe they have never felt a single hesitation about bothering me.
Yeah.
And that's how I like it. I want them to feel they can always come to me if they need to.
Yeah.
And that did become habitual. When I first started doing it, I had to think, smile, when you really wanted them to go away because you were watching TV or whatever. But I really do think I have largely managed to be welcoming when my children have asked to see me or talk to me.
Yeah. One of the things I love about that depiction of the moral life and the comparison to musicians or any other craftsman or the physician or the architect and so forth is that it's the beautiful picture it gives of liberty or to freedom. Obviously there's a sort of real good to a liberty construed in terms of freedom from burdens and freedom constraints or freedom from tyranny. Those are true political goods. But there's this other sort of liberty that comes on the other, as I say to my students, it comes on the other side of discipline, right? It's a submission to a craft. And through a submission to a craft over a lifetime, one becomes capable of doing something that so-called mere mortals could not do.
Well, I don't think anybody's ever sort of finished and final great-souled man, magnanimous man.
Yeah.
I think that you be in trouble if you decided that you were finished.
Yeah, it's always in progress, right?
a finally virtuous product, But I think that, it is a discipline. It takes a serious decision. And at first, it takes a very great deal of time. I mean, taking a decision any decision takes time. And we don't take enough time to do it. We don't. That's why I tie this up with them being the peripatetics, the walking ones. I do think walking is incredibly, taking the dog for a walk is incredibly good time to think, put your phone down and think through difficult decisions.
Yeah.
So it is very much like learning any other craft. And he says that the Greek word for that is techne. It's where we get technical from. It's a techne. Virtue is a techne like any other. And the trouble, I think, quite often is the very word virtue can put people off.
Right.
When I'm talking to Americans, I tend to say, just do the right thing. It's like, just be a decent person, we would say in English, do the right thing in American. We all tend to know what the right thing is to do in circumstances. He does believe in sort of intuition.
Yeah.
Into the intuitive good. But very often we haven't been equipped with the ability to put that into practice. And that takes time and a very great deal of effort and often self-sacrifice.
Yeah. How do you frame that up in terms of the notion of authority? That I suppose that one could see that there are, as opposed, for example, to one like Immanuel Kant, who sees the kind of the epitome of the moral life as autonomy, freedom from external authority. It seems like with Aristotle, you have this notion there can be unhelpful authority, tyrannical authority, or there can be helpful, needful authority to help one grow in the moral life. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so, though I don't get the impression from reading him that he particularly liked being under anybody's thumb himself. And he didn't get to be fully free to do what he wanted to do with his life till he was 49. I mean, his own life is really interesting because he was, first of all, I think the 20 years under Plato, that was good authority. And he learned so much. Between 17 and 37, he was Plato's student at the academy and blossomed and developed all his ideas in dialogue with Plato, even though he eventually rejected a lot of them.
Right. Yeah.
But so then he had to go off. He was summoned to this horrible court of Philip the Great of Macedon, which was murder, assassination, poisoning, treachery, adultery on a daily level, daily basis. I don't know. I sometimes wonder how he survived. As soon as Philip was assassinated, Alexander went off to Asia. At 49 years old, he finally got himself to Athens, set up his own university the way he wanted it, the Lyceum. So I think his actual own life is a very good model of how you don't sort of give up, but nor do you lose sight of your true goal.
Right.
But there was a kind of authority at the Lyceum, but in that they had to sign up to a particular way of life and a particular program, that they were all committed to education and research and so on. I don't think authority is quite the right word. It's more that you submit yourself, to your own best self, and don't let transient temptations derail you.
Continuing to keep your eye on that, your own telos.
Yeah.
And continue to facilitate the growth of those things in yourself toward that end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's quite interesting that actually, one of the most interesting things is adultery, because all ancient Greek men were allowed to commit adultery. They had ample opportunities for it outside the house, with people of either sex, and it wasn't even particularly criticized, provided you didn't bring it home to your front door. And he says, no, it's absolutely not all right. And the reason why it isn't all right isn't because, sex is bad. He thinks sex is great, but because it destabilizes trust in your foundational relationship, which will make you unhappy as well as the other person.
Yeah, right.
So because that trust of that foundational relationship, and he thinks all of society builds up from the pair, the couple, then you inject this toxic dose of distrust, which destabilizes absolutely everything. And I found this, it's certainly made me never be strayed by the wayside. What is the point of a transient pleasure if it wrecks the really great building block of happiness? There's just no point at all. There's no comparison between the happiness that each of those will give you.
Yeah, remarkable. How do you, as a woman, deal with Aristotle's treatment of women and slaves?
Okay. Politics book 1. Aristotle genuinely believes, as did everybody else in antiquity, practically everybody else in antiquity, that women were in every way intellectually and morally inferior to men. Strangely, he partly thought that because he looked at the animal world and he saw difference in size and so on, and because he's very clear that man is humans are animals, he drew that inference. He also argued that slavery, if it was of non-Greeks, and he did definitely think that some people from non-Greek cultures were inferior intellectually, and therefore probably morally, because the two go together for him. And he did not agree with those people who, there were a very few who wanted to abolish slavery on the ground that it was against human nature. This is what I say to him, okay? So I point out that the whole of the politics is actually insists, and I've thought about this an awful lot lately with the American political situation, that the Constitution must be eternally open to revision in the light of, and this goes with his whole concepts about deliberation, right? Either new information, or a persuasive argument, okay?
Yeah.
Or a new experience. You must constantly revise. And he says it's because no lawmaker can ever conceivably anticipate all possible occurrences that may arise. He cannot do it. Right. So you cannot create a constitution that won't need adjustment. And he actually cites, he's done research on 200 different Greek city-states, and he cites a city where he says in the old days we used to carry arms in public life, right? We used to arm ourselves to go to the assembly. We civilized Greeks have given all that up. We wouldn't dream of having a city-state where ordinary people were armed in the street. I always want to say that to the NRA, actually. And the other one is we used to have a society where we bought our wives just for money, like cattle. And he says we've given all of that up. Those are the two things he cites. So I would simply show him all the very great evidence that we've now accumulated that there's no such thing as racial differentiation in intelligence or gendered differentiation. I would not only show him all the data, but I would also argue, because I'd been educated in a way that ancient Greek women were, most persuasively, using his own terms. And I would then point to the passages, which are very many in the Politics, where he is insistent that you must always be open to revising your constitution.
Right. Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
It does indeed. Yes. Very helpfully. Do you think that, well, I'll tell you my sort of a working presumption that I haven't worked at quite a great deal yet, but certainly from my own experience, as someone raised, as I said, in a conservative Christian tradition, and then I come to the virtue traditions through theological studies, and come to virtue tradition through studying among the Catholics and reading Aquinas and Alistair MacIntyre, who points me to Aristotle and the virtue traditions and so forth. All of a sudden, I find in that these terribly helpful correctives to so-called right-wing or so-called conservative moralisms, perfectionism, religious legalisms, and so forth. Fundamentalism and so forth, yes. But increasingly, as I watch the far left in American context, I'm also seeing parallels in the far left that look a lot like what I saw in the far right growing up, and what you can still see in the far right. And it seems to me that both the far right legalist types and the far left legalist or shaming types could learn a great deal from the virtue tradition. So what's your thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the biggest danger is taking any tenet whatsoever, whatever it is, left wing, right wing, as undiscussable. I find this incredibly frightening, and yes, encroachments on freedom of speech are being made all the time at the moment. What is or is not permissible to say. Now, we have to have a huge discussion, because I don't believe in offense for the sake of it, ever. I think if one can avoid offending somebody else's sensibilities, one should do so, but not at the cost of losing my right to express my opinion. Now, that's a difficult thing, but Aristotle would certainly defend the need to examine all received opinions at all time. I mean, he calls them those. You start from them. He says you start from them. They're called the endoxa. You actually, if you've got a question of should we carry guns? All right. You're going to start by listing all the views, justifications, defenses, apologies, and arguments against that have ever been made. Right. You've got to start from somewhere. You don't start by trying to pluck a new absolute out of the sky. You work it from those to your own sensible position in the society that you're in. Okay. So just the very idea that you cannot examine any tenet is completely it would be outrageous to him. That's the whole point of being a philosopher, is that you've got to examine why we assume things. I know these things are incredibly difficult and tense at the moment. They are on British campuses. There's been a lot of deplatforming of one kind or another going on, but and it's quite difficult, because I regard myself as fiscally very left wing, but morally and socially very liberal. And that's not actually something you often find, if you see what I mean. People tend to sign up to a whole bag of beliefs, which means they've got to take on the whole thing.
Right.
And I don't want to do that. I want to examine every single one on its own merits.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have hope that this sort of approach can continue to make a contribution socially right now? And what might it look like for that to happen, given the real threats of deplatforming, to use your language you just used?
I think what we need is, what I would like to see is absolutely everybody in the world getting trained in moral philosophy in their teens. Secular moral philosophy. Secular because you can accommodate mild versions of any religion to virtue ethics, right? I mean, not if you think that a divine law from out there will trump, transcend, or negate a human law, but you yourself do that. I have many Catholic friends who are also Aristotelians. Many. I have a Zoroastrian friend who is an Aristotelian. That is perfectly possible. But what I think we don't have enough of is people actually learning the techne, as we said, of moral philosophy at school. And I find that I go to schools to talk about it constantly, and they are so thirsty for it.
Right.
They are so thirsty. When I say I can teach you Aristotle's 9-point plan for taking a decision to your own best interest, how to make a decision. Nobody has ever done that with them before. They have never done it before. I tell them how to write your CV to be as persuasive as possible, which Aristotle tells you in the Rhetoric, which is just by studying human nature. You will be able to write a better CV without telling any lies, right?
Yeah.
And they are so thirsty for it, and I think we're depriving them of it. And if everybody in the world could sign up to the same sort of secular system, I think we would make very quick advances. Yeah,
I will say that in my context where I do teach theological ethics,
you do, yeah.
I have this one particular class for undergrads that I've just started experimenting with in the last couple of years. And we did this class in which we look at the overlap between Aquinas's moral theology. We look at Aristotelian moral philosophy, and we look at positive psychology.
Right.
We look at the overlap of those three and these very practical ways to live life.
Yep.
And students as you said, they just drink it up. It's like, finally, I've got something here by which to construe what it looks like to live a good life. And
exactly. And I think it is a bit different. I think people are more religious. A large proportion of the population in the USA has a faith than is the case in Britain, where I think more than half of people say they don't believe in any form of God. But young people do not get a set. They are not trained in how to behave in any coherent way anymore. Certainly since the 1960s, and I think that's just totally irresponsible of adults, is that they're not helping kids learn the techne of right action.
Yeah, and the wake of pain and suffering, unnecessary pain and suffering that comes in the wake of that. So, well, we've been talking to Edith Hall on her relatively new book, Aristotle's Way, How Ancient Wisdom Can Change Your Life. Thank you so much, Professor Hall. We're very grateful for your time today.
I've enjoyed it very much indeed. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Frances Fry.
And I'm Ann Morris.
And we are the hosts of a new TED podcast called Fixable.
We've helped leaders at some of the world's most competitive companies solve all kinds of problems.
On our show, we'll pull back the curtain and give you the type of honest, unfiltered advice we usually reserve for top executives.
Maybe you have a coworker with boundary issues, or you want to know how to inspire and motivate your team.
No problem is too big or too small. Give us a call, and we'll help you solve the problems you're stuck on. Find Fixable wherever you listen to podcasts.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.